Good morning, church.
Good morning.
Before I begin my sermon today, I just want to say that today's sermon is going to be a little bit different than what we've had. This is a call to action kind of sermon. But know that no matter where you are, that we're here to support and love you. And so if this is too much for you today, that's okay. But I hope that it speaks to your hearts. I hope that it compels you to action. So listen now for the word of God. It's found in Matthew 5, Matthew 5, verse 1 through 12. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up to the mountain. And after he sat down, the disciples came to him. Then he began to speak and teach them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs will be the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evils against you. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God." As I returned this morning from the Leadership Academy conference, which I just attended, we did the work of dreaming and planning and thinking about what the future of this church looks like. And I come back filled with excitement. I'm thankful that I had time to dream and hope for the future. I'm excited because I see that we get to be a small part in what God is doing across our denomination, across the church in our country, and globally. We play a role in that as we begin the work of church planting, and I am excited. And when I think and when I pray about what I really want for this community, what I want when people describe us, I want people to say, "Oh, that church. Oh yeah, they're the church doing the work of peacemaking." Because I believe that Jesus calls faithful communities to be peacemakers. A couple weeks ago, I mentioned that I did an internship as a chaplain in a hospital in the heart of St. Louis, and it was a really tough summer. Before starting, I was told that St. Louis was a city that suffered from great amounts of violence. But I wasn't prepared for what I would see. I was not prepared to talk with a father who was in the same hospital where his first son had died at the hands of violence, praying that his second son would pull through his own gunshot wound. I had no way to prepare to be with people every single day who had the experience of someone else trying to take their lives. And I certainly wasn't prepared to pray for a 16-year-old who would die on the operating table from a gunshot wound to the chest before I could even learn his name. And I'll be honest, I didn't know how to make sense of it. I want to be the kind of chaplain, the kind of pastor, the kind of Christian who always points to hope. But honestly, I left that summer in St. Louis feeling pretty hopeless. And we know that St. Louis isn't the only city that suffers from violence. We know that violence can be everywhere. And I'm not just talking about physical acts of violence, but social, mental, emotional, environmental, and economic violence as well. It sometimes feels like it's surrounding us. So when I read this text about a new way of living that Jesus offers, I have to say I'm drawn in, because I long for the world that Jesus describes. I long for a world that values peace, mercy, and righteousness. But don't we all? I'll be honest. I often think, what can I do? How can I be the peacemaker that Jesus speaks of? Because when I'm confronted by the reality of violence, I feel hopeless and helpless, like nothing I can do will even matter. And as a new pastor, I so desperately want to be faithful to this call to be a peacemaker. But I know it isn't easy work. I know that confronting violence in our world is something that will take so much of who I am. But the thing is, I don't have to do it alone. And you don't have to do it alone. We can do it together. And while this work might feel downright impossible at times, we know that it is holy work that we must keep on doing if we want to find new life. When I read this passage, I can't help but notice that peacemaking is all the way down in verse 9. But I don't think it's an afterthought. Rather, I think that this is the climax of this passage. It's as if all the other virtues in this passage culminate to the ultimate call, the call to be a peacemaker. Last week, we talked about the value of mourning together. This idea of mourning comes up again in verse 4. It says, "Blessed are they who mourn, for they will be comforted." Maybe the first step in becoming a peacemaker is to mourn, to cry out at injustice, to lament the suffering that we and our neighbors experience. When I was in St. Louis, every day when I was walking from my car or from the hospital to my car, I would pass this little house, and in their yard had a small white sign with simple black lettering, and it said, "We must stop killing each other." We must stop killing each other, a message that is so simple and at the same time so deeply profound. I hear Jesus, along with this anonymous sign maker, crying out with a broken heart, "Please, please, we must stop killing each other." I hear this cry in so many ways. We gossip and slander rather than encourage and build up. We must stop killing each other. Prisons exist that literally profit from locking human beings up. We must stop killing each other. 26% of our neighbors in Warner Robins live below the poverty line. We must stop killing each other. The abuse and disrespect of women's bodies is a cultural norm. We must stop killing each other. We value the lives of our LGBTQ brothers and sisters as less than. We must stop killing each other. We don't take care of our earth, so our neighbors don't have clean water to drink and clean air to breathe. We must stop killing each other. Our communities are plagued with racist attitudes and systems that are unyielding. We must stop killing each other. I could go on, but you get the idea. If we don't mourn these deaths, then how can we even start the work of peacemaking? This passage goes on to say, "Blessed are the meek." If we are going to do the work of peacemaking together, let us remember that we have to do it together. One person can't end the violence in St. Louis or in Georgia, let alone the world. We must approach this task with a humility of heart, knowing that there will be times that we mess up, times that we don't get it quite right, times that our good intentions go awry. But even in that, grace abounds. Hear that. Grace abounds in our good intentions. Grace abounds when we don't quite get it. In our meekness, we must continue to hunger and to thirst for righteousness. This is when it seems like Jesus is making a turn from the passive to the active. This is when Jesus calls us into a life of radical action. This passage is by no means just a praise for those living an ascetic life of meekness and humility. No, Jesus is calling us into this work. The virtues that Jesus upholds in this passage are completely countercultural to the values of this world, and we are called to embody them. And we know that this way of living may not be welcomed by all, because it challenges those who have power to give it up. It means that we live as a community in a way that will shake up our city. And here's the thing about cities and systems. They don't like to be shaken up. For example, let's take mercy, mentioned in verse 7. It's not often that we hear people being praised for their tendency to show mercy. Instead, we praise those who do justice with force and vengeance. A pastor friend of mine, Pastor Chad, often says, God's justice looks like mercy. I think he is getting at a truth in this passage, that we all too often equate justice with vengeance. But the work of peace calling calls us to stop cycles of revenge and move towards the value of mercy. And I know it may feel like a lot, but this is what we are called to do. This is what the gospel is calling us to do. Because if we valued mercy, like Jesus says in this passage, not only when we show mercy, then we will receive mercy. Thus, a cycle of violence is replaced with a cycle of peace. I believe that Jesus is calling our very way of being in this world to shift, and in our neighborhood. When we long for righteousness in this world, we act to stop the violence of racism, the violence of sexism, the violence of poverty, the violence within our own homes and churches. When we are peacemakers, we can no longer sit back and then let injustice rule the day. Rather, we are called to usher in God's kingdom here on earth. If you're wondering, what does it look like to usher God's kingdom? Look no further than this passage. God's kingdom on this earth ultimately looks like peace. It looks like everyone having a seat at the table, everyone being valued for who they are. It looks like the hungry having enough, the stranger being welcomed in, the prisoner being set free. It looks like offering forgiveness when it doesn't make sense to forgive. It looks like walking away from the allure of power and status, making room for those traditionally left out. It looks like shifting away from a model of charity where the giver has the power to a model of partnership and community where power is shared. Activist Lilia Watson says, "If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come here because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." What Watson speaks to highlights the countercultural message of Jesus. It's not about going and doing a good thing here and there. It's about the way we are connected with others. And I know that seems different, but I actually think that you will find life when you are connected to your neighbors, to the people who are around you. When Jesus says, "Blessed are the peacemakers," I don't think he's talking about an individual blessing, though it certainly will be a blessing. But I think it's a blessing for the community, because each of our liberation, as Watson rightly points out, is bound together. When I walk away from the temptation of violence, not only am I saved from the consequence of my action, but I work to break cycles of violence in my community. My liberation and your liberation and our neighbor's liberation and our country's liberation is all bound together. Therefore, we must work together. What I've been most impressed about by this community over the past month is your great, big, open hearts. I can see that this is a group of people that share in my desire to do something new, something different, something countercultural. I can sense, and I have a good sense of these things. I can sense that your open hearts that you have shown me will pave the way for doing this peacemaking work. We don't live in the same kind of violence as St. Louis, but there is still work to be done here to break our own city systems of violence. And I really truly believe, I wouldn't tell you this if I didn't, but I believe that you're up to the task. I look forward to the ways that God will move us to think differently, to act as agents of peace in our city. And the end of verse 9 says that peacemakers will be called children of God. I think that this is because We are most like our Maker when we work towards peace, when we stop killing each other and we offer ways of life instead. And I know, and I get it, I know this is no small task and it can feel overwhelming, but I believe that as we work together as a community, each day, we can become a little bit more humble, a little bit more merciful, and a little closer to that righteousness, and ultimately, a little closer to the peace that we all long for. And I suppose that's where I began to find my hope again. Amen.